The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, a lonely song that echoed the solitude of the small, one-room schoolhouse. Inside, Miss Abigail clutched a worn copy of Little Women, her brow furrowed as she prepared for the day's lessons. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the faces of her 8 students, a motley crew of farm children, eager and bright-eyed despite their threadbare clothes. Abigail loved her students fiercely. They were her family, her purpose in this isolated corner of the territory. She arrived fresh from finishing school back east, full of ideals and a desire to make a difference. The reality of frontier life was harsher than she'd imagined, but her dedication never wavered. She taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also kindness, compassion, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Her days were filled with the simple rhythms of rural life. The scratching of chalk on the slate, the giggles of children during recess, the scent of wildflowers carried on the breeze. Evenings were spent grading papers by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, mending clothes, and dreaming of a future where her students would have opportunities she never had. The town of Dust Creek, if you could even call it that, was a scattering of rough-hewn buildings clinging to the edge of the vast, unforgiving landscape. The townsfolk were a mix of farmers, ranchers, and drifters, each with their own story etched on their weathered faces. They were a hardy bunch, suspicious of outsiders but fiercely loyal to their own. Abigail, with her gentle demeanor and unwavering optimism, had slowly earned their trust. She was more than just a teacher. She was a confidant, a healer, a source of comfort in a world that often offered little of either. She knew their struggles, their hopes, and their fears, and she carried them with her, a quiet burden that fueled her every action. She was the glue that held this fragile community together, a beacon of light in the gathering darkness. But even she couldn't foresee the storm that was brewing, the events that would test her courage and force her to confront the hidden shadows that lurked beneath the surface of Dust Creek. The day was about to begin, but this day would be different. This day, everything would change. The change began with the storm. It wasn't unusual for violent weather to sweep across the plains, but this one felt different. The sky turned an ominous shade of purple, and the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows of the schoolhouse and sending tumbleweeds dancing across the barren landscape. The children huddled closer, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and excitement. Abigail tried to reassure them, reading aloud from their history books, but even her voice trembled slightly. The storm seemed to mirror a growing unease within her, a premonition of something ominous to come. As the day wore on, the storm intensified. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the outside world into a hazy gray. The school day ended early. Abigail bundled each child into their heavy coats, watching as they scurried off towards their homes, disappearing into the swirling rain and wind. She was alone. The schoolhouse creaked and groaned under the relentless assault of the storm. Abigail busied herself tidying up, trying to distract herself from the unsettling feeling that clung to her like the damp air. As darkness began to fall, a sudden violent gust of wind ripped open the schoolhouse door, sending a shiver of cold air through the room. Abigail rushed to close it, but as she did, she saw a figure collapsed on the porch. It was a man. He was lying face down in the mud, his body battered by the storm. Abigail hesitated. She was alone, miles from any help. The man could be dangerous. But as she looked at his still form, a wave of compassion washed over her. She couldn't leave him to die. With a surge of adrenaline, she dragged the man inside, her small frame straining with the effort. He was heavier than she expected, his body solid and muscular beneath his tattered clothes. She managed to get him onto the old cot in the corner of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He was unconscious, his face pale and gaunt. His clothes were soaked and torn, and a deep gash ran across his forehead. He was clearly feverish, his skin burning to the touch. Abigail knew she had to act quickly if she wanted to save him. She grabbed a bucket of water and some clean cloths and began to tend to his wounds. The storm raged outside, but inside the small schoolhouse, a different kind of battle was being waged. A battle against the elements, against fear, and against the unknown. And Abigail, armed with nothing but her compassion and her unwavering spirit, was determined to win. The first few days were a blur of fevered dreams and whispered prayers. Abigail tended to the stranger tirelessly, changing his bandages, spoon-feeding him broth, and dabbing his brow with cool water. He remained mostly unconscious, muttering incoherently in his sleep. She caught snippets of words betrayal, justice, lost, hinting at a troubled past. Slowly, the fever began to break. He stirred more frequently, his eyes fluttering open for brief moments before drifting shut again. One morning, Abigail found him awake, staring at the ceiling with a dazed expression. Where am I?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "You're safe," Abigail replied softly, offering him a cup of water. "You're in my schoolhouse." He looked around the small room, his gaze lingering on the rows of desks and the colorful drawings pinned to the walls. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossed his face before vanishing. He drank the water gratefully, his eyes fixed on Abigail. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Abigail," she said. "Abigail Harding, I'm the school teacher here." He didn't say anything for a long moment, just studied her face. "Thank you," he finally whispered, "for helping me." "You're welcome," Abigail replied. "What's your name?" He hesitated, a shadow passing over his features. "Jedediah," he said eventually. "Just call me Jedediah." Over the next few days, Jedediah slowly regained his strength. He was a man of few words, but Abigail sensed a deep sadness within him. He spoke little of his past, deflecting her questions with vague answers and a haunted look in his eyes. He told her he was a drifter, just passing through, but Abigail suspected there was more to his story than he was letting on. She noticed the way he carried himself, the quiet authority that seemed to emanate from him even in his weakened state. She saw the calluses on his hands, the scars that crisscrossed his body, the way his eyes scanned the horizon with a watchful intensity. This was not the demeanor of a simple drifter. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Abigail decided to press him further. "Jedediah," she said gently, "you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I can see that you're carrying a heavy burden. Maybe it would help to talk about it." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated again. The secrets he held were buried deep, guarded by years of silence and regret. But something in Abigail's kind, compassionate gaze gave him the courage to begin. The storm outside had subsided, but a different kind of storm was about to break within the walls of the schoolhouse. Jedediah sighed, the sound heavy with regret. He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. "It's a long story, Abigail," he began, his voice low and gravelly, "and not a pretty one." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was a lawman," he finally said, "a marshal in a town not too far from here." Abigail's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I was good at my job," Jedediah said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "I kept the peace, I protected the innocent, or at least I thought I did." He took a deep breath, the firelight dancing on his face, highlighting the lines of weariness etched around his eyes. "There was a bank robbery," he continued. "A gang of outlaws came into town, guns blazing. We fought them off, but they got away with the money. We tracked them for days, finally cornered them in a canyon." His voice grew quieter, more strained. "We had them outnumbered. They were ready to surrender, but I made a mistake. I rushed in, thinking I could end it quickly. There was a shootout. Innocent people got caught in the crossfire. A young girl, she was killed." He closed his eyes, as if trying to block out the memory. Abigail reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. "It wasn't your fault, Jedediah," she said softly. He shook his head. I was responsible. I was supposed to protect them, but I failed. The town turned on me." They blamed me for the girl's death. They called me a murderer. I couldn't stay there. I resigned my post and left. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with anguish. I've been running ever since, he said, trying to escape the guilt, the shame. But it follows me everywhere I go. Abigail squeezed his arm. You made a mistake, Jedediah, she said. But that doesn't make you a bad person. You were trying to do the right thing. I don't know anymore, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe I'm not cut out for it. Maybe I'm just a curse to anyone I try to protect. He fell silent, lost in his own thoughts. Abigail didn't try to interrupt him. She knew that the wounds of the past ran deep and that healing would take time. But she also knew that Jedediah was a good man, despite his flaws and his regrets, and she was determined to help him find his way back to the light. The confession had brought them closer, but the weight of Jedediah's past still hung heavy in the air, a silent reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. As Jedediah regained his strength, he started to help Abigail around the schoolhouse. He chopped wood for the stove, repaired the leaky roof, and even fixed the broken window pane, his movements efficient and skilled. He possessed a quiet strength, a competence that belied his self-doubt. One afternoon, while Abigail was busy preparing lessons, she noticed Jedediah sitting with young Billy, one of her slower students, patiently explaining a math problem. Billy, who usually struggled with numbers, was actually understanding the concept, his face lighting up with comprehension. Abigail watched, a warmth spreading through her heart. Jedediah had a natural gift for teaching, a way of connecting with the children that she hadn't anticipated. He started helping her more regularly, working with the students who needed extra attention, sharing stories of his travels, carefully omitting the details of his past as a marshal, and inspiring them with his quiet wisdom. He told them about the importance of honesty, courage, and standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. His words resonated with the children, who looked up to him with a mixture of respect and affection. Abigail found herself drawn to Jedediah's gentleness and intelligence. She admired his strength of character, his willingness to confront his past, and his genuine desire to help others. They spent hours talking, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets. She told him about her own aspirations, her desire to make a difference in the world, her longing for a life beyond the confines of Dust Creek. He listened intently, offering her words of encouragement and support. A connection began to form between them, built on mutual respect, understanding, and a shared sense of purpose. It wasn't a romantic love, not yet, but something deeper, something more profound. It was a bond of kindred spirits, two souls who had found solace and companionship in each other's presence. The schoolhouse, once a place of solitude for Abigail, now felt like a sanctuary, a haven from the harsh realities of the world outside. Jedediah's presence had brought a new sense of warmth and vitality to the small community, and Abigail found herself looking forward to each new day with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. But the peace and tranquility were not destined to last. The whispers had begun, and the storm clouds were gathering once more on the horizon. The whispers started subtly, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. A hushed conversation at the general store, a furtive glance in Abigail's direction, a sudden silence when she entered a room. At first she dismissed it as small-town gossip, but the feeling of being watched, of being judged, grew stronger with each passing day. Then came the news. The stagecoach, the lifeline to the outside world, had been robbed. A notorious outlaw known only as Black Bart had ambushed the stage, stealing a large sum of money and leaving the passengers stranded in the middle of nowhere. Fear gripped Dust Creek like a vice. The townsfolk, already wary of strangers, became even more suspicious, their eyes darting nervously at anyone they didn't recognize. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by fear and misinformation. Black Bart was said to be ruthless, merciless, a killer who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Some claimed he was hiding in the hills, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Others believed he had already left the territory, disappearing into the vast expanse of the West. But one rumor, whispered in hushed tones, was particularly unsettling. It claimed that Black Bart had an accomplice, someone who was already living among them, someone who had helped him plan the robbery and was now waiting to collect their share of the loot. Suspicion fell on anyone who was new to town, anyone who was different, anyone who didn't quite fit in. Jedediah, with his mysterious past and his reluctance to talk about himself, became a prime target. People started to avoid him, their friendly greetings replaced with suspicious stares. Abigail noticed the change in their behavior and felt a surge of anger and protectiveness towards Jedediah. She knew he was a good man, despite his past mistakes, and she refused to believe that he was capable of such a heinous crime. But she also understood the fear that gripped the community, the desperation to find someone to blame for their misfortune. She tried to reassure the townsfolk, to reason with them, but her words fell on deaf ears. The fear was too strong, the rumors too persistent. The town was on edge, teetering on the brink of chaos. Abigail knew that something had to be done, that she had to find a way to restore peace and trust to the community before it was too late. But she also knew that she was facing a formidable challenge, a force of fear and prejudice that threatened to consume everything in its path. The stage was set for a confrontation, a clash between reason and ignorance, between compassion and fear. And Abigail, caught in the middle, was about to face the greatest test of her courage and her convictions. The tipping point came with the arrest of young Thomas, a shy, stuttering boy whose older brother, it was rumored, had been seen riding with known outlaws. Thomas, a student of Abigail's, was innocent. He stammered out his denials, tears streaming down his face, but no one believed him. Deputy Clem, a nervous, inexperienced man, was pressured by the townsfolk to hold Thomas until the real Black Bart could be found. With no jail in Dust Creek, Thomas was confined to a small storage room attached to the schoolhouse, a temporary holding cell until he could be transported to the next town. The rumors, fueled by fear and whiskey, escalated into something far more dangerous. A Lynch mob formed, a ragtag group of men armed with rifles and shotguns, their faces contorted with anger and righteous indignation. They were convinced that Thomas was Black Bart's accomplice, that he knew the location of the stolen money, and that he deserved to be punished. The leader of the mob was Silas, a burly rancher whose wife had been a passenger on the stagecoach. He was a man driven by grief and a thirst for revenge, and he had whipped the townsfolk into a frenzy. Abigail pleaded with them, begging them to see reason, to trust in the law, to give Thomas a fair trial. But her words were drowned out by the shouts and threats of the mob. They were determined to take justice into their own hands, to hang Thomas from the nearest tree as a warning to any other outlaws who dared to cross their path. Jedediah, his face grim, stood beside Abigail, his presence a silent warning to the mob. He knew what they were capable of, he had seen it before. He had seen good men turn into monsters, driven by fear and a thirst for revenge. The mob surged forward, surrounding the schoolhouse, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. They demanded that Abigail release Thomas to them. Abigail refused, standing firm in the face of their threats. "He's just a boy," she cried, her voice trembling but resolute. "He hasn't done anything wrong, you can't do this." Silas stepped forward, his eyes burning with anger. "He's an accomplice to a thief and a murderer," he snarled. "He deserves to hang." He raised his rifle, aiming it at Abigail. "Step aside, Miss Harding," he warned, "or you'll be next." The tension in the air was thick, palpable. A single spark could ignite the powder keg and unleash a torrent of violence. Abigail knew that she was standing on the precipice of disaster, that the fate of Thomas, and perhaps the entire town, rested on her shoulders. She braced herself, ready to face whatever came next, determined to protect the innocent, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. Abigail stood her ground, her voice ringing out in the night. "You're making a mistake," she cried. "Thomas is innocent. You can't let fear and anger cloud your judgment." Silas sneered. "He's guilty by association, Miss Harding. His brother is a known criminal." "That doesn't make Thomas a criminal," Abigail retorted. "He's a good boy, a bright student. He deserves a fair trial, not a rope." She turned to the rest of the mob, her eyes pleading. "Please," she begged, "think about what you're doing. Is this the kind of town you want to be? A town that resorts to violence and injustice?" Some of the men looked down, their resolve wavering, but Silas's influence was too strong. He raised his rifle higher, his voice filled with venom. "Enough talk, we're wasting time. Get out of the way, Miss Harding, or you'll regret it." Jedediah stepped forward, placing himself between Abigail and the mob. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Put down your weapons and go home." Silas laughed. "And who's going to make us, old man? You." He gestured to the mob, and several men raised their rifles, aiming them at Jedediah. Abigail gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly helpless. "Don't do this," she cried. "Please don't do this." The mob surged forward, pushing past Jedediah, their eyes fixed on the schoolhouse door. Abigail tried to stop them, grabbing at their arms, pleading with them to stop, but they were too strong, too determined. One of the men shoved her aside, sending her stumbling to the ground. She landed hard, her head hitting a rock. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she struggled to stay conscious. As she lay on the ground, she saw the mob break down the schoolhouse door, their faces contorted with rage. She heard Thomas scream, his voice filled with terror. She tried to get up to help him, but her head was spinning and her body wouldn't respond. She was helpless. The mob was about to drag an innocent boy to his death, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. The tension reached a fever pitch, the air crackling with anticipation. The fate of Thomas and perhaps the entire town hung in the balance. Everything was about to change. It was time for Jedediah to make a choice. It was time for him to reveal who he truly was. Inside the schoolhouse, chaos reigned. Silas and two other men dragged Thomas outside, a rope already around his neck. The boy sobbed, begging for his life, but his pleas were lost in the roar of the mob. As Silas prepared to string Thomas up to a nearby oak tree, Jedediah pushed himself to his feet, his face a mask of determination. He knew he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent boy die, not again. He had to do something, even if it meant revealing his true identity and risking his own life. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice ringing out with an authority that surprised even himself. "Stop!" he commanded. The mob turned to him, their faces filled with confusion and anger. "Get out of the way, old man," Silas snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when you're about to hang an innocent boy," Jedediah retorted. He paused, gathering his strength. "My name is Jedediah Grant," he announced, his voice clear and strong. "I was the marshal for this territory." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The name Jedediah Grant was well known, even in Dust Creek. He had been a respected lawman, a symbol of justice and order, but that was before the tragedy, before the incident that had shattered his career and left him a broken man. "Grant," Silas scoffed, "you're that disgraced marshal. It's the one who let that little girl die." Jedediah's face hardened, but he didn't back down. "I made a mistake," he said, "a terrible mistake, but that doesn't give you the right to take the law into your own hands. Thomas is innocent." "I know it." "How can you be so sure?" Silas demanded. "Because I know what guilt looks like," Jedediah replied, his voice filled with pain, "and I don't see it in that boy's eyes." He looked at the mob, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "You're all good people," he said, "decent people. Don't let fear and anger turn you into something you're not. Trust in the law. Let justice take its course." His words seemed to have an effect. Some of the men lowered their weapons, their expressions thoughtful, but Silas remained defiant, his eyes filled with hatred. "I don't care who you are, Grant," he snarled. "This boy is going to hang." He raised his hand to signal the mob to proceed, but Jedediah was ready. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to take action to show them that he was still a force to be reckoned with. He had to become the Marshal once more. Despite his still weakened state, Jedediah moved with a surprising swiftness. He grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, using it as a makeshift walking stick for support, and positioned himself between Silas and Thomas. He may have been a disgraced marshal, but he still remembered the oath he had taken, the duty he had sworn to uphold. "Silas," Jedediah said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands, "you know this is wrong. You can't just string up a boy based on rumors and suspicion." "He's guilty," Silas insisted, his face flushed with anger. "He's helping Black Bart." "Do you have any proof of that?" Jedediah challenged. "Any real evidence? Or are you just letting your grief and anger blind you to the truth?" He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "I know you're all scared," he said. "I know you're angry, but this isn't the way to solve anything. Violence only breeds more violence. Justice demands a fair trial, evidence, and due process, not a lynch mob in the middle of the night." He drew on his knowledge of the law, citing precedents, reminding them of their rights and responsibilities as citizens. He spoke of the importance of upholding the principles of justice, even in the face of fear and adversity. He reminded them of the values that had built their community, the values of fairness, compassion, and respect for the law. "I know I'm not the man I used to be," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I made mistakes in the past, I let people down, but I'm not going to let it happen again. I'm not going to let an innocent boy die." He looked at Silas, his eyes pleading. "Please, Silas," he said, "think about what you're doing, think about the consequences. This isn't justice, this is murder." For a moment, it seemed as though his words were getting through. Silas hesitated, his grip on the rope loosening slightly. Some of the men in the mob lowered their weapons, their faces etched with doubt. But then Silas's anger flared up again, fueled by grief and a deep-seated need for revenge. "I don't care about the law," he snarled. "I don't care about justice. I just want to see him pay for what he's done." He raised his hand, signaling the mob to proceed. The tension in the air was unbearable. Jedediah knew that he was running out of time. He had tried to reason with them to appeal to their better nature, but it wasn't enough. He had to find another way to stop them, a way that wouldn't involve more violence. But what could he do? He was just one man, weak and wounded, against a mob of angry, armed men. He needed a miracle. He needed something to shift the balance, to break the spell of fear and anger that had gripped the town. And then he saw Abigail stirring on the ground, her eyes fluttering open. A spark of hope ignited within him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. Abigail, though still dazed, saw the scene unfolding before her. She saw Jedediah, frail but resolute, standing between Thomas and the mob. She heard his words, his impassioned plea for justice and reason, and she knew that she couldn't let him face this alone. With a groan, she pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain in her head. She staggered forward, joining Jedediah in front of the mob. "He's right," she said, her voice weak but firm. "Thomas is innocent. You can't do this." Her appearance seemed to have an effect. Some of the men shifted uneasily, their eyes filled with doubt. They respected Abigail, they trusted her judgment. If she believed in Thomas's innocence, maybe they were wrong, but Silas was not swayed. He glared at Abigail, his face contorted with rage. "You're just a naive schoolteacher," he sneered. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand that you're about to commit a terrible injustice," Abigail retorted. "I understand that you're letting your anger and grief blind you to the truth." She stepped forward, placing herself directly in front of Silas, her eyes challenging his. "If you want to hang someone," she said, "you'll have to hang me first." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the men started to back away, their resolve crumbling. They didn't want to hurt Abigail, they didn't want to be a part of this. but Silas was too far gone. He was consumed by his need for revenge, driven by a darkness that had taken root in his soul. He raised his rifle, aiming it at Abigail's chest. "So be it," he snarled. The standoff reached a fever pitch. Jedediah knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Silas hurt Abigail, he couldn't let this madness continue. But what could he do? He was weak, wounded, and outnumbered. He looked around, desperately searching for a solution. He saw the fear in Thomas's eyes, the doubt in the faces of the mob, the unwavering determination in Abigail's gaze. And he knew that he couldn't give up. He had to find a way to break through the darkness to restore the light. He took a deep breath, focusing all of his remaining strength and will. He knew that this was his last chance. He had to do something, anything, to stop the impending violence. The next few moments would determine the fate of Thomas, Abigail, and the entire town of Dust Creek. The clock was ticking. The moment of truth had arrived. Just as Silas squeezed the trigger, Jedediah acted. Drawing on a surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, swinging his makeshift walking stick with all his might. The branch connected with Silas's rifle, knocking it from his hands. The rifle clattered to the ground, and Silas roared with fury. He lunged at Jedediah, his fists clenched. Jedediah, weakened from his illness, struggled to defend himself. He dodged and weaved, using his years of experience as a lawman to anticipate Silas's moves. As Silas swung wildly, Abigail saw her chance. She darted forward, grabbing the fallen rifle. She didn't know how to use it, but she knew she had to do something to help Jedediah. Silas, distracted by Abigail, stumbled, giving Jedediah the opening he needed. With a final burst of strength, Jedediah grabbed Silas's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to his knees. "Enough," Jedediah shouted, his voice hoarse. "This has to stop." He looked at the mob, his eyes pleading. "Are you going to let him ruin your lives? Are you going to let him turn you into murderers?" The mob hesitated, their faces etched with doubt. They saw the pain in Jedediah's eyes, the desperation in his voice. They knew that he was right. They couldn't let Silas control them anymore. Suddenly, one of the men stepped forward. "He's right," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't the way." Another man followed suit. "We're better than this," he said. Slowly, one by one, the men in the mob began to lower their weapons. They had come to Dust Creek seeking justice, but they had almost crossed the line into barbarism. Jedediah's words, combined with Abigail's courage, had brought them back from the brink. Silas, realizing that he had lost, struggled against Jedediah's grip, his face contorted with rage. But it was no use. The mob had turned against him. He was alone. Abigail, still holding the rifle, stepped forward. "It's over, Silas," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "It's time to let go of your anger and grief. It's time to find peace." With the help of some of the other men, Jedediah disarmed Silas and tied his hands behind his back. The lynching had been averted. The violence had ended. The town of Dust Creek had been saved, but the night was far from over. The true test was yet to come. The identity of Black Bart and the reason why he targeted Dust Creek were still mysteries to be unraveled, and it was up to Jedediah, with Abigail's help, to uncover the truth and bring justice to the town. One by one, the men dispersed, their heads bowed in shame. They had come to the schoolhouse seeking vengeance, but they were leaving with a heavy burden of guilt and regret. They had almost committed a terrible crime, and they knew that they had been wrong. Deputy Clem arrived, belatedly, summoned by one of the townsfolk who had finally found his conscience. He looked at the scene with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He had been too afraid to stand up to the mob, but he was grateful that Jedediah and Abigail had intervened. He took Silas into custody, promising to transport him to the next town for trial. As he led Silas away, he looked at Jedediah with a newfound respect. "Thank you, Marshal Grant," he said. "You did the right thing." Jedediah nodded, his face weary. He was still weak and wounded, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. He had protected the innocent and upheld the law just like he had sworn to do. Thomas, still shaken but unharmed, was released from the storage room. He ran to Abigail, throwing his arms around her. "Thank you, Miss Harding," he sobbed. "Thank you for saving my life." Abigail hugged him tightly, her heart filled with relief. "You're safe now, Thomas," she said. "Everything is going to be all right." As the last of the mob dispersed, Jedediah and Abigail were left alone in the schoolhouse, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "You were amazing, Jedediah," Abigail said, her voice soft. "You saved him." "We saved him," Jedediah replied, smiling slightly. "It took both of us." He looked around the schoolhouse at the desks, the books, the colorful drawings on the walls. It was just a small, simple room, but it had become a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the power of compassion and courage. But the night was not over. The mystery of Black Bart still loomed large, casting a shadow over Dust Creek. Jedediah knew that he couldn't rest until he had uncovered the truth and brought the outlaw to justice. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with determination. "We have work to do," he said. "We need to find Black Bart." Abigail nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. "Then let's get started," she said. The ordeal had strengthened their bond, forging a partnership that would be tested in the days to come. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to bring peace and justice to the town of Dust Creek. The next morning, Dust Creek was a different place. The fear and suspicion that had gripped the town had dissipated, replaced by a sense of relief and gratitude. The townsfolk, ashamed of their actions the night before, came to the schoolhouse to apologize to Abigail and Jedediah. They offered their help in finding Black Bart, providing information and support. They had seen Jedediah's courage and compassion, and they realized that they had misjudged him. He was not a disgraced marshal, haunted by his past. He was a hero, a protector, a man who was willing to risk his life to save others. Jedediah, though still scarred by his past, felt a sense of redemption he hadn't thought possible. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he had also done good. He had protected the innocent, upheld the law, and restored peace to a town that had been on the brink of destruction. He started to investigate the stagecoach robbery, questioning the townsfolk, examining the scene of the crime, piecing together the clues. He discovered that Black Bart had targeted the stagecoach because it was carrying a large sum of money that belonged to a wealthy landowner who was planning to foreclose on several farms in the area. Black Bart was not just a common thief. He was a vigilante, a desperate man who was trying to save his neighbors from ruin. Jedediah understood his motives, but he also knew that his methods were wrong. He couldn't let him get away with robbery and violence. With Abigail's help, Jedediah tracked Black Bart to a remote cabin in the hills. They found him holed up, nursing a wounded arm. He surrendered without a fight, realizing that he had been outsmarted. Jedediah brought Black Bart back to Dust Creek, where he was given a fair trial. The judge, impressed by his motives and the fact that he had not harmed anyone during the robbery, gave him a lenient sentence. The stolen money was returned to the landowner, who, after hearing Black Bart's story, agreed to postpone the foreclosures and work out a payment plan with the farmers. Justice had been served. Peace had been restored. The town of Dust Creek had been saved, not once but twice, by the unlikely partnership of a compassionate schoolteacher and a disgraced marshal. And as the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the prairie, Jedediah and Abigail knew that they had made a difference, that they had brought light to a world that was often shrouded in darkness. Their journey together was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that they had each other and that they had the strength to overcome anything. Days turned into weeks, and life in Dust Creek slowly returned to normal. The children were back in school, the farmers were tending to their fields, and the townspeople were rebuilding their lives. Jedediah helped Deputy Clem restore order, sharing his knowledge and experience. He even considered accepting the town's offer to become their permanent marshal, but a restlessness stirred within him. He had found a measure of peace in Dust Creek, but the ghosts of his past still lingered. He knew that he could never truly escape the guilt and regret that haunted him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jedediah told Abigail about his decision. "I can't stay here, Abigail," he said, his voice filled with sadness. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, and I'll never forget this place. But I don't belong here. I'm not meant to settle down." Abigail listened quietly, her heart aching. She had grown to care for Jedediah deeply. She admired his strength, his courage, and his compassion. She had hoped that he would stay, that they could build a life together in Dust Creek, but she also understood his need to move on, to find his own path. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have to do what's right for you." "I'll never forget you, Abigail," Jedediah said, taking her hand in his. "You changed my life. You showed me that there is still good in the world, that there is still hope for redemption." "You changed my life too, Jedediah," Abigail replied, her eyes filled with tears. "You showed me the true meaning of courage and compassion. You taught me that even the most broken people can find a way to heal." They sat in silence for a long moment, holding each other's gaze, their hearts filled with unspoken emotions. They knew that their time together was coming to an end, but they also knew that their bond would never be broken. The next morning, Jedediah packed his few belongings and prepared to leave. The townspeople gathered to say goodbye, offering him their gratitude and their best wishes. Thomas ran up to him, throwing his arms around his legs. "Thank you, Marshal Grant," he said. "I'll never forget you." Jedediah smiled, patting Thomas on the head. "You stay out of trouble, son," he said, "and remember, always stand up for what's right." He turned to Abigail, his eyes filled with love and sadness. "Goodbye, Abigail," he said. "Take care of yourself." "Goodbye, Jedediah," Abigail replied, her voice trembling. "May your journey be safe, and may you find the peace you're searching for." Jedediah mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the vast expanse of the prairie. Abigail watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew that she would never see him again, but she also knew that his memory would stay with her forever, a reminder of the power of compassion and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Abigail stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, watching as Jedediah's figure grew smaller and smaller in the distance, until he was just a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. A tear trickled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She knew that Jedediah was on his own journey, and she had to let him go. She turned and walked back into the schoolhouse, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. The room felt empty without Jedediah's presence, but it also felt filled with the echoes of his kindness, his courage, and his compassion. She looked around at the familiar surroundings, at the desks, the books, the colorful drawings on the walls. This was her home, her purpose, her life. And she knew that she had a responsibility to continue the work that she and Jedediah had started, to bring light and hope to the children of Dust Creek. She walked to the window and looked out at the vast prairie, the same prairie that had brought Jedediah to her doorstep, the same prairie that had witnessed their shared triumph over darkness. She knew that life in Dust Creek would never be the same. The events of the past few weeks had changed her, the town, and its people forever. They had faced their fears, confronted their prejudices, and discovered the true meaning of community. They had learned that even the most broken people can find redemption, that even the smallest acts of kindness can make a difference, and that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. With a renewed sense of purpose, Abigail turned to face her students, who were waiting patiently for her to begin the day's lessons. She smiled, her heart filled with love and gratitude. She knew that she had a long and challenging journey ahead of her, but she was ready to face it, armed with the lessons she had learned from Jedediah and with the unwavering support of her students and the community of Dust Creek. She opened her copy of Little Women and began to read, her voice filled with warmth and passion. As she read, she thought of Jedediah riding across the prairie, searching for his own peace and redemption. She hoped that he would find what he was looking for, that he would finally be able to lay his ghosts to rest. And she knew that.